Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is part 2. So if you haven't watched part 1 yet, push pause. This will be here when you come back and watch part 1 of this video. This is part 2, Curse of Palmyra, Tensions on the Atoll. Second order of business, I just want to mention that Stephanie Stearns was found by a jury to be not guilty of the murder of Eleanor Muff Graham. So where we left off, it was June 1st, 1974, and the Iola is on its way to Palmyra with Buck and Stephanie Stearns and 3 dogs. In this picture here, you see Stephanie's dog, Puffer. And they also had 2 of Buck's dogs. I believe they were both black labs. One was named Sista and the other one was named Popolo. And just to give you a reminder of the Iola state, that Walker had fixed it up by giving the boat a new skin. And this skin was simply applying 220 gallons of resin over thousands of yards of fiberglass. This is a wooden hulled boat that had been sunk and then sat outside in the sun for 2 years. So it says here, okay for a weekend spin, but the resin would upset the hydrodynamics of the boat, making it definitely not recommended for long distance sailing, certainly not open water or blue water sailing. But Walker, he put up a mast and a boom in the rigging, and when he launched it, it leaked. And it leaked on a shakedown trip to Oahu, and it leaked 2 weeks later on a trip to Kauai, and it was still leaking when they set out that June 1st for Palmyra. Okay, every wave that bashed over the bow, it took over water through a faulty front hatch. This is a problem, and they were using a hand pump to bilge out the water. A hand pump. What we know about this 1,000-mile trip from Hawaii to Palmyra Atoll, it comes from Stephanie's testimony and Buck's testimony, and then just the simple logistics of when the boat left and when the boat arrived by other witnesses. What we know comes from them, and we know that the battered Iola arrived outside Palmyra Atoll on June 19th. Now they left on the 1st. It should have only taken them a week, 7 days at the most, between 4 to 7 days to get to Palmyra. It took them 19 days to get outside of the Atoll. Just as a side note, on June 19th, 1974, at that same time, Jack Wheeler and his Poseidon, that was his vessel, was on Palmyra. He had come there for a pleasure cruise and to also represent the owners, that's the Fullard Leos. And just note, I've got some old articles. A Wheeler had been assigned to Palmyra as early as 1957 for a year or more. So he was more than well familiar with the island and familiar with its owners. So it's June 19th. Iola arrives outside of Palmyra and sadly is unable to make its way to landfall because of the way the boat was, the way the winds were, and they didn't have a motor to motor themselves in. So they were trying to catch the right time to get into the channel. This is crazy. And also note that they got there by Stephanie navigating from a book she purchased. She said in the trials that Buck was useless because he got so dang seasick that he was unable to help her even in the worst of the storms. And then his idea of curing the seasickness was to have food in his stomach, so he proceeded to eat a whole bunch of their stores, and allegedly they only had 4 months worth. It's not a good situation even when they arrive outside on the 19th. It's really clear that the defendants really did not know how to blue water sail. And the channel at Palmyra leading into the lagoon is difficult to navigate due to it being narrow. But this broken old scow, the Iola, had a broken motor. And the Iola's wooden hull was leaking badly. It had only 1 set of sails and the rigging was rusty. It just was a mess. So let's read this article. With the island in view, Walker had 2 serious problems: locating the man-made channel that cut through the reef and was difficult to see in the shimmering waters, and navigating it without the benefit of engine power. The channel led to the peaceful lagoon where they could dock, but using sails made the task tricky. As he searched for the channel, he also feared the reef and sailed further out. and then lost sight of the island completely. Lost it for 2 days and nights, and on the third day, it reappeared, and Buck and Stephanie spent another day locating the channel. Still, the winds were wrong, so they anchored outside, waiting. Another day passed. It must have been with some degree of envy as they watched another ship, the Charter Caroline, pass by with its crew waving, lower its sails, and power up the channel into the lagoon's peaceful water. I just want to note, what kills me about this is Buck was a fugitive on the run, and when you went to Palmyra in those days, you were supposed to contact the owners and ask them for permission to stay there. Of course, not everybody did that. And Wheeler was there as a representative, but then they end up taking off after a while. But the thing is what did he think? Did he think that nobody else would be there on the island and that they were just going to be sitting up there growing seeds, having a huge grow island with nobody else there? But then he knew about it. I mean, come on. He had to have thought on some point that there were going to be some other folks there, right? And thank God that there were, right? So now we're talking June 25th, 26th, 1974. Mind you, they left on the 1st. They left on the 1st. This is insanity that it was by the 27th that people went out there to try and help them. Jack Wheeler and Larry Briggs, they both end up in two separate kind of like dinghies, go out there to help tow in the Iola. Briggs' main vessel was the Caroline, the one that floated by and waved at him. Probably didn't know that they were in distress. Just, floated on by in. This says, Wheeler and Briggs watched as the Iola hit the reef and went out to help Stephanie and Buck. The 30-footer wasn't in good shape. It had been built in 1940 and eventually registered at Kihei, Maui by Buck. He signed his name as Roy Allen. We already mentioned all this. There was little food on the Iola and some 2 pounds of marijuana seed and some fertilizer. Stashed aboard the Sea Wind, now mind you, we've already talked about Mac and Muff, but they're here in this article, they're giving you the contrast between the haves and the have-nots. There are 2 tons of supplies, enough to last the Grahams for a year. Just giving you that taste. And also, Stephanie and Buck had 2 nasty-tempered dogs they had brought with them, and more on that. So the Iola has 2 humans and 3 dogs on board. One was a sweet dog, Puffer, and 2 not so sweet Labradors that are going to be kind of vicious and biting people on the island. So part of the Iola's hold was taken up with a 2-month supply of dog food, and that space would have normally been filled with the kind of foodstuffs and staples for the people on board to supplement island living. So Buck and Stephanie had brought a lot of pot seeds and dog food. Stephanie and Buck are calling themselves Roy and Stephanie Allen. So Buck clearly, mind you, has his nickname tattooed on his arm. Long story short is he wants everybody to call him Roy, but he's meanwhile got his nickname Buck on his arm. We're going to keep calling him Buck, but he was telling them his name was Roy. So, strangely enough, Briggs recognized the old Margaret. That Iola that had been Margaret? He recognized it, and he later testified at trial that I was surprised to see it around, and it had no mainsail. Of course, adopting the castaway lifestyle, Buck is going around ungroomed. I think he had some kind of dentures or something, so he was missing his teeth and he didn't wear his teeth. So he's all tatted up, looking really wild. And again, I mentioned that they have 2 of their dogs I think they might have been actually just hungry, but they're snapping at people. Stephanie's there acting sort of hippie-ish, I guess, and she's got that sweet little dog Puffer, and they're talking about having dreams of starting this grow island, having a big crop of marijuana on an atoll, and we'll get to that, how that was not ever going to be feasible. Stephanie and Buck were on the island about 3 to 4 days before the Sea Wind arrived. The Sea Wind arrived on July the 1st, just glided on into Palmyra, and they weren't too pleased either. That couple, the Grahams, weren't too pleased to be finding all these other boats there. I mean, I think that both couples had this ideal that they were kind of going to be the only ones on the island. So the Grahams are kind of guilty of that too, thinking that really there weren't going to be a lot of folks there. And so their method of getting communication back with the mainland was anytime that a boat would leave Palmyra, the Grahams would give them letters. And then whenever those boats got into port, they would mail the Grahams letters. And also, as mentioned before in the first part, the Grahams had a ham radio, and twice a week they had outside communication. So let's talk about the food situation on Palmyra Atoll. Could a human exist on this atoll with no outside food? And the answer is absolutely yes. There are certain fish there that are affected, or were affected, I don't know if it still is this way, by a ciguatera poison. So you had to know which kind of fish to catch that were okay to eat, and there were plenty that were okay to eat. There's also heart of palm. At that time on this island, it was just covered with palm trees. And at a certain point of its growth process, you can get to the heart of the palm, and it's almost like a salad. So you can have that. You can have unlimited fish, unlimited heart of palm, and unlimited coconuts. And also, there's different things. If you enjoyed trying to eat them, you could attempt. Could you survive on this deserted island with no other food? Yes, you could. Would you be hungry and irritated with the same food all the time? Absolutely. Now, would the food jump onto your plate prepared without effort? No. So if you're extremely lazy, you're going to find it being quite difficult to live on that island. So the Wheelers were there, Briggs was there for a while, different ships came and went, not too many, but a few during the time of this story. And there's a stark contrast between the two couples. You have the Grahams, who have 2 tons of food in their larder. They have ham, they have turkey, they have roast, they have champagne, all of it. And they're supplementing their stores from food from the island. They're eating the coconuts. They're fishing every day. And Muff had spent like 2 years planning and packing for this trip. They didn't have dog food and marijuana seeds on their vessel. They had packed appropriately, right? But then you have the Allens, Buck and Stephanie. She thought she would try to grow some vegetables on the atoll, but she didn't have any success. And here's the reason why. An atoll at most is 5 to 6 feet above sea level, and it doesn't really have any dirt, barely any dirt. It's coral, okay? So there's a tiny bit of dirt underneath like some of the trees. And she would try to gather this dirt, and it would take her all day long just get a little bit of dirt. And then once she'd get the dirt and then put the seedlings in the dirt, the rats and the crabs would eat all the seedlings of anything that was planted, because the island was covered in rats, Navy rats, wharf rats. The island had not eradicated the rats. So while the island had abundant fish, coconuts, hearts of palm, land crabs, and you could just go up to a crab, that's one thing you could do, and just rip its arm off, and it would generate another claw, and you could cook that claw. But it takes effort. And so many times Buck, lazy as he was, would waste bullets trying to shoot the mullet in the water. I kid you not. People saw this. People saw him taking a chainsaw to cut down the coconut tree instead of shimmying up the tree to get the nuts. This is a level of lazy that Buck Walker exhibited. And some of the other sailors could also hear, while the Iola was just simply moored in the lagoon, that the bilge was going. Someone was manually bilging out the Iola. So clearly the boat was still taking on water even while not at sea. So keep that in mind. Eventually Buck sets himself up a camp on the land, and I think they allege in the book, or Stephanie told Vincent, that it was just too cramped inside the Iola, so Buck sets up camp on the land. So let's discuss the simmering tensions on this remote atoll. As July drug into August, I think the atoll was on simmer. Mac Graham loved Palmyra, and Muff Graham hated it. And the tensions were also building between July and August between the couples. It wasn't just the obvious differences, the aesthetic differences in the couple's outward appearance, with, Mac being like military high and tight, and Muff dressed up in her silk bathing suits with her jewelry collection, while Buck's going around toothless, sometimes bare-assed, and looking like a castaway. It wasn't just that. Mac was attacked by one of Buck's dogs. And actually, the walker's dogs had bitten 3 people in 2 months. And while one of them even got a serious infection from the bite. 2 weeks after the Iola arrived, Mac had even helped turn the Iola around to protect it from the lagoon's winds. And then Mac had even retrieved the Iola's anchors from when they had gotten stuck. And Buck didn't even offer thanks for Mac returning the anchor. The Grahams were different kinds of people. They were more conservative, military types. And Stephanie and Buck were more hippie types at best and, frankly, outlaws at worst. The 4 trials that result from this time period on the island, which we'll get into later, will later reveal different people's comings and goings and discussions with all the players. Stearns, Walker, the Grahams, Mac, and Muff. And we won't get into that here, but just suffice it to say that tensions were starting to flare. Popolo, the black pit bull, had bit Jack Wheeler's son on the leg, and they end up pulling out on July 6th. So Wheeler had left the atoll by the 6th. Let's look at what some of the other folks had to say about that time. Dr. Donald Stevens was one of the last people on Palmyra before the incident happened, and he noted that Mac really liked Palmyra most of all because it was normally deserted, and that Mac was like a 40-year-old kid, like a Robinson Crusoe. This article talks about how Mac taught Buck how to fish and how to differentiate which of the catch was poisonous. It also talks about how Stephanie went bathing in the Graham's water supply, which ticked off the couple. Dr. Sanders said of the 2 couples that they were a basic mismatch. Mac was short, back and sides, military type with a lot of money, and these other 2 were not even hippies. They didn't exactly have that flower child feeling. Now keep in mind, actually Mac didn't have a ton of money. He just saved well, and whatever money he did have, that they would go sailing, and then whenever, it was time to go back to work, he would go back to work. The Pollocks were another couple that were on Palmyra for a short amount of time as the other 2 couples, and they feature prominently in the 4 later trials because of the fact they helped to raise the alarm when the Grahams went missing. And Marion, I think it's Marilyn, by the way, Mrs. Pollock, recalls being on the Sea Wind for a dinner, and she's just stunned because they had a refrigerator and they had meat, and that Muff had fixed a roast, and they had a very special dinner, like a captain's dinner, and Muff had put out the very best dishes with Tiffany silver and crystal, and it was elegant. They got all dressed up for it, and that they, enjoyed themselves from 6 to midnight. And I mean, she's just like talking about the absolute luxurious yacht, for that time. They had heirlooms in there, silver, crystal, dishes, and so on. So you can just imagine the difference between the different sailing groups. And some of the other people that were coming and going noted the bad feelings between the couples that seemed to be staying, the Grahams and the Allens, notably Edwin and his wife Marilyn Pollock of Honolulu. And of course, if somebody left out from Palmyra, Mac and Muff would have letters to send out to the families for them to post in the next port of call. And on July 13th, Muff had sent a letter to Mac's sister, quote, "Roy and Stephanie have no sugar, no cigarettes, and next they'll be asking us, but we didn't come here for that, and I'll have to tell them no." And Muff wrote that the hippie couple came only with a 2-month supply of dog food, and they won't have enough. And Muff also wrote that Mac taught Buck how to fish, and quote, "Unless we take them fishing, they won't catch fish. What a mess. Why did we have to arrive at the same time?" As time went on, the witnesses are reporting that the pair were kind of unresponsive to each other. Again, they talked about how Buck would chop down palm trees with a chainsaw to get the coconuts instead of getting them correctly, and that they also let their dogs run wild. And they ended up biting just about everyone. They just believed in doing their own thing, and if you didn't like it, too bad. One of the witnesses, Wolf, had opinions about the incredible ridiculousness of bringing 3 dogs to this small atoll. and that he would not ever have sailed their boat, and that Walker had tried to trade with him, tried to trade a broken buck knife, and that he went ahead and traded with him and gave him a can of chili for a broken buck knife, because you can always repair the buck knife back on the mainland. They have like a lifetime guarantee. He also gave Stephanie a 5-pound bag of flour and some brown sugar. And there's something really important that I forgot to mention, that the Allens, Buck and Stephanie, they were expecting to have a couple come and resupply them. And the concept was for them to grow the marijuana and then trade the grown marijuana for the resupply. But the thing is the marijuana didn't grow. Now, I don't know if that was a factor in the fact that they didn't get their resupply. The couple that was going to come to Palmyra and give them some goods never showed up. But I don't think it's because they couldn't get their marijuana going. I think it was just for whatever other reason they couldn't get resupplied. So that also added more tension to the situation. And the couple were considering what they could do if, in fact, they didn't get the resupply. And at this point in the story, they didn't know. So they're just talking about what could be done. Many years later, 4 trials later, Tom Wolfe spoke with Kurt Roulette over email about his time at the island. And he says, Buck introduced himself to us as Roy Allen when we first arrived and tied up right behind his boat to some old and very large boat dolphins. Boat dolphins are maybe like poles sticking out of the water that you could tie up on. He came out in the dinghy and helped us just a bit, but within 5 minutes he asked if we had any dope on us. No. Since we were very tired from being up all night, I promptly forgot his name, but could have read the tattoo on his arm, Buck, and he called him that from then on, to which he answered without any obvious aggression or irritation. So the movie was wrong in that respect. I was there with Norm Sanders, 6'2", maybe 255 pounds, and between us we were very fit and more than a match for Buck physically. So while he was clearly in our minds a lowlife, in truth he treated us with a reasonable respect and certainly was circumspect in any discussions about the Grahams. Possibly he was already planning their murder. He was, however, truly inept about sailing, fishing, navigation, and mechanics, so he had some urgency in figuring out what to do for the long haul. He knew, and I told him as well, that his boat would be very hard-pressed to get to Fanning Island straight upwind with no motor. I suggested that Samoa, being situated downwind, would be safer, but of course, a longer voyage. Norm and I made it the 1,300 miles to Samoa in a 29-foot boat with no incident in 13 days. Tom Wolfe continues, Stephanie was getting concerned about survival and was trying to grow a garden on top of one of the old buildings. She was using the top because of the crabs and the rats. She was upset and complained to me that Buck would always try to use her hard-won topsail on the roof to try and grow dope. Stephanie was truly inept as well when it came to fishing or finding food to eat. The fact that both Buck and Stephanie were sort of starving was really amazing to me. Their big problem was laziness. She and Buck had figured out how to gather hearts of palm, but fishing, well, Buck's idea was to go to an old concrete pier and shoot with a .22 caliber revolver, small mullet, as they swam by. In truth, a row in the dinghy of maybe a mile at most would take you to a fishing area where only hooks, half lures, were required for as many fish as you wanted. A different half-mile row or mile walk and a short swim could take you to another island where crabs and nesting birds abounded. Acquiring a crab dinner was at most a 60-minute effort. Lobsters were apparently catchable on the reef at night using a light and spear, so starvation was not an issue if any effort was applied to it. In one of the trials, Wolfe told about the fish shoot, and he said, during the fish shoot with Roy, Buck, above us, my friend got very uptight and later said he could have shot us. This guy wanted to leave the island immediately, Wolfe added. Muff was a very nice lady. I liked her, but I got the feeling she wanted to leave too. You think? Wolfe testified that towards the end, the relations between the couples were very, very bad. He told Kurt Roulette, On our final night, the Grahams invited us to dinner, and by this time, Muff had made it perfectly clear to me over the last few days that she did not like to be there on Palmyra any longer, and that she really hated Buck and Stephanie. We had just heard that morning that Buck's friends, who were supposed to be coming down to resupply them, were not going to come after all. So the message was passed on by Mac's ham radio, which really added to her depression. During this dinner, Mac ended up showing us his gun collection, including the Derringer and the .357 Magnum revolver. In the end, I simply told Mac and Muff to be careful, as these guys could kill you and steal your boat and probably never get caught. And Mac's answer to that was, "I'm tougher than they are." And please note that he used the word they, not he. So clearly he was referring to both Buck and Stephanie. Here's another version of what he said, essentially the same thing. The Grahams and the Allens didn't like each other. I remember we mentioned how easy it would be for someone to just disappear down there. Graham just kind of laughed it off with something like, "Well, if he tries to get me, I'll get him first." Graham was, as usual, prepared. So, and then they said that the following day, that's August 17th, the Taloa sailed for Hawaii. I gotta say, I don't know what was wrong with Mac Graham when his wife is terrified and wants to leave and he isn't leaving. It's almost like two alpha males are fighting against each other to be king of the atoll in a way. You know what I'm saying? Because Muff was clearly telling the other people around how afraid she was of this couple. I mean, she cried to Marilyn Pollock that she didn't think she'd even leave the island alive. That's scary. There was one person on the island of Palmyra that had said they saw quote-unquote friendly relations between the couple, probably earlier in the time frame. But that person also went on to say that Muff made it clear that she did not want Stephanie on her boat. Okay, so I think the die was cast whenever the relay came back to Curtis Schumacher, who relayed it to Mac Graham on their twice-weekly ham radio chinwags, that the resupply mission was off. So what happened was Buck and Jennifer had reached out to try to find out when they were going to get resupplied. That group, Richard Music and some girl named Patty, got back with Curtis and said, "Nope, we can't make it. We can't resupply. We won't be coming to Palmyra until late October." And so that Schumacher told Mac got it to Buck and Stephanie that the resupply was going to happen. And obviously Buck and Stephanie weren't comfortable living off what the island could provide, so they were going to have to decide what they were going to do. And they thought, well, maybe we'll go to Fanning. That was the story, that they were going to try to get the Iola to Fanning Island against the wind. And in my opinion, the Iola was completely unseaworthy to make it to Fanning. Completely, would not have made it there, would have sunk. That is my opinion. It would not have made it to Fanning. It was barely, in my opinion, doing well sitting in an atoll in a lagoon with barely any wind at it. It was still having to be manually bilged out. So in my opinion, that boat wouldn't have made it there, and everybody told them that, and I think they knew that. But I think, in my opinion, they made the pretense of pretending they were going to go. It just so happened that there was other people on the island along with the Grahams. But then when Miss Dr. Sanders went to leave, then it only left the two couples there by themselves. Dr. Sanders says he found the couples feuding over the atoll like the desperate youngsters in William Golding's Lord of the Flies. He sensed Walker's instability. Dr. Sanders hated the atoll as forcefully as Muck hated it. He later talks about how it's a place where vinyl rots. And he said at court that he urged the Grahams to leave the atoll, but that Mac refused. But he said 4 days later, and this is probably in between the time that they got the "hey, we're not getting resupplied" information, that Dr. Sanders felt compelled to leave the atoll. And it just ended up leaving the two couples there together. And the relatives of Mac and Muff start getting letters, because, time's delayed. And they said they would talk about the other couple. One of the main things they said is that the couple were out of food. And also, Graham's mother wrote to him back to some of his letters, "They will hurt you. Leave. Get away from there." So she was pleading with Mac to please leave the atoll. But, he just wasn't the type of guy, I guess, to back down. And then finally, on August 27th, Shoemaker and Graham had that normal weekly radio conversation, and Max said it was good news, but that the Allens, Buck and Jennifer, were leaving the next day, that they were going to try to go for Fanning to get food, and that he was happy about it because, they'd been a problem. He was happy they were finally going to leave for Fanning. And as Schumacher's on the ham radio with Mac, he says, I remember Mac saying, like, he hears voices, and it's obviously Muff's with him, and he hears probably Stephanie's voice, and he says, I guess they're going to declare a truce. And much will be made of this in the trial, because truce implies there's been a war, because you have a truce whenever you've had a disagreement, right? So he says they're bringing a cake over tonight, implying that they were going to have like a farewell dinner before the Buck and Stephanie go off to Fanning. And that is the last anyone hears of the couple. That's it. Curtis Schumacher is the last person to speak with Mac Graham. And after that, the couple, known as Roy and Stephanie, roll up into Honolulu on the Seawind, on the Graham's boat. Yeah, you heard that right. You heard that right. So if you want to find out what happened to Buck and what happened to Stephanie, stay tuned for part 3. Please hit the like, please hit the subscribe button, and do all those YouTubey things. And without further ado, have an excellent day. Bye.